What strange event happened on Campbell Island in 1931? Ranch owner John Warren, along with a group of investors and shepherds, fled the island, swearing that they would never return. They abandoned everything they owned, including 4,000 sheep. The animals were left without anyone to care for them or shear their wool regularly, and without food or veterinary treatment. Even the most experienced shepherds insisted that every one of them would die in agony. Their bodies and bones did, in fact, become scattered across the island. When two scientists, Don Orwin and Peter Wilson, first arrived, they were stunned by the devastation. Only 907 barely surviving animals remained. They even concluded, nature is erasing the mistake humans left behind. Yet just 8 years later, the sheep population unexpectedly surged back to nearly 4,000 without any human assistance. To investigate this strange phenomenon, veterinarian Jim Hutton, parasitologist Alan Heath, and several other experts traveled to the island in 1975. What they witnessed overturned everything they had spent their entire lives learning, so much so that one of them reportedly said, "I wish we had never come here." Campbell Island would certainly seem like a place where no human would ever want to live. Isolated in the Southern Ocean, more than 370 miles from the mainland, this subantarctic mass of rock is constantly battered by powerful winds and drenched by rain 320 days a year, while its terrain is almost entirely mountainous and hilly. Yet in the late 19th century, during the merino wool boom, Campbell Island looked like a gold mine to investors. It offered thousands of acres of grassland, abundant fresh water, and most importantly, no natural predators at all. The first person to recognize the business potential of Campbell Island was James Gordon. In 1895, he leased the island and brought 400 sheep there, believing that its vast green grasslands would provide an endless supply of free food. But that lush appearance was misleading. The native grass was coarse, the peat soil contained few nutrients, and the sheep produced less wool than expected. Transporting that wool more than 370 miles across the Southern Ocean consumed nearly all the profits. Within 5 years, Gordon went bankrupt and abandoned the island. Captain William Henry Tucker believed that Gordon had simply raised too few sheep. He brought in thousands more, built shelters and fences, and expanded the flock to around 8,000 animals. But more sheep only created more problems. The shepherds had to work through hail, rain, and deep mud, while supply ships could take more than a year to arrive. Food ran short, wool piled up, and transportation costs remained far too high. In the end, Tucker also failed. The final attempt was made by John Warren. Then the Great Depression struck in 1929, causing wool and meat prices to collapse. Warren and his workers were stranded on the island for nearly 2 years. When a ship finally arrived in 1931, they abandoned the farm. Nearly 4,000 merino sheep were left behind because transporting them back to the mainland would have cost more than the animals were worth. After 35 years, humans had finally surrendered to Campbell Island. As you saw from the beginning, the cost of transporting the sheep back to the mainland was simply too high, so the entire flock was abandoned. It could be said that merino sheep are among the worst sheep on earth when forced to survive in the wild. They were selectively bred for one purpose only: to produce as much wool as possible. Without shearing, their fleece continues to grow longer and longer. In 2021, a wild merino ram named Bareric had to carry nearly 77 pounds of wool, equal to half of his body weight. On this island, cold rain and snow turned the matted fleece into a heavy, waterlogged mass that dragged down their body temperature, exhausted them, and caused them to die in agony. On top of that, the island's ecosystem had already been completely devastated since the 19th century by seal hunting and the destructive impact of Norway rats. The truth is that the sheep died in enormous numbers. In the next section, we will explain why those 907 sheep did not continue dying, but instead began multiplying again and developing strange changes in both their bodies and appearance. We still have to admit that this flock achieved something far beyond anyone's expectations. Campbell Island was not a peaceful pasture. After every winter, it eliminated the weakest individuals. Humans had released goats and pigs on Campbell Island even before the sheep arrived, but in the end, only the sheep survived. Prepare yourself for the truth I am about to reveal. The same violent winds that once defeated humans actually protected the flock. The powerful winds prevented many flying insects, disease-carrying flies, and external parasites from establishing stable populations. Water was never scarce either. It collected in rocky hollows, coated the vegetation, and turned the ground into one enormous reservoir. When storms arrived, the sheep crawled into cracks in the volcanic rock, sheltered beneath cliffs, and pressed closely together to retain body heat. No one guided them. No barns protected them. No rescue ever came. In just 8 years, the sheep carrying the strongest genes survived, and the population climbed back to 4,000. During the summer of 1975-1976, nearly half a century after humans abandoned Campbell Island, a New Zealand scientific expedition arrived there. The team was led by veterinarian Jim Hutton and included parasitologist Alan Heath, along with several experts in soil, plants, and animals. They brought ropes, collars, and food to restrain any sheep that might be transported back to the mainland. At first, they intended only to capture a small number of sheep, examine their health and wool, and determine whether the flock isolated for 44 years was carrying any dangerous diseases. But from the very first hours, everything unfolded completely differently. The first thing that stunned them was that these were no longer domestic sheep. 10 scientists attempted to drive about 200 to 250 animals into an enclosure. Without sheepdogs, they believed they simply needed to close the circle around them gradually. But the sheep repeatedly split into small groups, changed direction, and disappeared behind the hillsides. After hours of struggling, the team managed to contain only 58. They did not run together as a single flock like domestic sheep. Instead, they broke into smaller groups, constantly changed direction, and then returned to the exact areas they knew. Their behavior was more like that of wild animals than livestock. When the scientists began taking measurements, the findings were even more shocking. For hundreds of years, humans had consistently selected sheep that produced more wool, were more docile, and depended more heavily on human care. But Campbell Island had produced the exact opposite result. Each sheep now carried only about 3 pounds of wool, compared with the 9 to 11 pounds carried by a typical domestic merino, a reduction of nearly 70%. The thick fleece that had once been a valuable asset to farmers had become a burden on an island of cold rain and powerful winds. Sheep with shorter wool, or the ability to shed their wool naturally, survived more successfully and gradually became dominant. The scientists also documented a series of other changes that few people had previously believed could happen so quickly. The sheep had developed longer legs for climbing steep slopes, stronger jaws and teeth for chewing tough tussock grass, and broader chests and larger lungs for enduring the cold winds that blew almost year-round. Ewes often gave birth while standing, and newborn lambs had to get to their feet within minutes to find milk. If they remained on the cold, wet ground for too long, they could die within just a few hours. Nature, therefore, did not preserve the sheep that produced the most offspring, but those whose lambs were strongest and most capable of surviving. Many researchers later referred to this phenomenon as the Campbell reversal. Thousands of years of domestication had made sheep increasingly dependent on humans, yet in only about 2 human generations, this island had pulled them back in the opposite direction. This was also what astonished scientists the most. According to records from New Zealand's Department of Conservation and later studies, the rapid rewilding of the Campbell sheep has often been compared with that of the Soay sheep on Scotland's Street. Kilda Archipelago, a population that has lived in the wild for 4,000 years. Campbell sheep, by contrast, developed similar changes in less than a century, despite beginning as purebred merinos. To put that into perspective, the Soay sheep of Scotland's Street, Kilda Islands are considered a classic example of wild sheep. Yet in only half a century, natural selection reshaped the Campbell sheep into a form of life that their ancestors would probably no longer recognize. But just as the scientists were admiring the sheep's remarkable ability to survive, they discovered a far more troubling truth. As the population recovered to several thousand, every additional mouth became a new source of pressure. Campbell Island's giant megaherbs, one of its most famous natural symbols, were repeatedly grazed down before they had a chance to flower. Native tussock grasses were given no time to recover, and young shrubs disappeared almost as soon as they emerged, making way for tougher grasses with little ecological value that the sheep did not like to eat. According to vegetation surveys conducted on the island and records from New Zealand's Department of Conservation, many palatable plant species gradually survived only on steep cliffs where the sheep could not reach them. Thousands of hooves trampled the peat soil, which had once been as soft as a sponge, compacting it, increasing erosion, and reducing its ability to retain water. the sheep became increasingly well adapted, while the island's ecosystem grew increasingly depleted. But in 1954, someone decided that they had to disappear. Campbell Island had been declared a protected area in 1937. In 1954, it officially became a nature reserve. Under New Zealand conservation law, every species introduced by humans had to be removed. The sheep, once considered an economic asset, were now classified as harmful invasive animals. But they were no longer ordinary sheep. They were a living evolutionary experiment. This may have been the only documented case of a fully domesticated animal returning to an almost wild state in less than a century. Removing them would mean destroying irreplaceable genetic data. But keeping them would allow the giant herbaceous plants that had evolved over millions of years to continue being trampled. Seabird nesting areas would remain disturbed. The island's original ecosystem could not recover, while 4,000 sheep continued grazing there. The scientific community was divided. Research papers pointed to the flock's potential genetic and commercial value and showed that the plan to eliminate the sheep did not have unanimous support. Conservation was now in conflict with conservation. Because neither side could convince the other, New Zealand decided to let nature provide the answer. According to reports from New Zealand's Department of Conservation, a fence about 1.1 miles long was built across the narrowest part of the island in 1970. North of the fence, approximately 1,281 sheep were removed. To the south, the flock was left untouched. Although we already know the outcome, they still had to wait. After only a few years, the sheep-free area began turning green again. The tussock grass grew taller, young shrubs reappeared, and Campbell Island's distinctive megaherbs showed clear signs of recovery. Meanwhile, the area where sheep remained continued to be grazed almost to the ground. By 1983, the sheep population in that area had actually increased from around 2,500 to 3,500, placing even greater pressure on the vegetation. By then, the evidence was undeniable. It was the sheep, not the climate or the soil, that were preventing the ecosystem from recovering. By the end of the 1980s, the sheep had to be killed to save the island. But before the final shot was fired, New Zealand decided to preserve a piece of the island's history. During the summer of 1975-1976, a special rescue operation was launched. According to Te Ara, the Encyclopedia of New Zealand, helicopters, sheepdogs, and search teams traveling on foot were mobilized to capture the healthiest animals alive. The work proved far more difficult than expected. In the end, they selected the 10 strongest sheep to be transported back to the mainland. Some areas were so muddy and the mountain slopes so steep that helicopters could not reach them. The scientists had to take turns carrying each sheep nearly 1.2 miles down to the shoreline. The largest ram, weighing about 143 pounds, was given the name Big Norm. Back on the mainland, these 10 sheep became the foundation of a strictly controlled breeding program. Every lamb was registered, and every pairing was carefully planned to reduce inbreeding because the entire population had begun with only 10 founding animals. The goal was not to create a breed that produced large amounts of wool, but to preserve a rare collection of genes. Later genetic analyses revealed something even more remarkable. According to studies cited in records about Campbell Island sheep, the frequencies of genes associated with wool fiber structure, body temperature regulation, lamb survival, and the immune system had all changed after decades of life in the wild. Most importantly, no new genes had been created. Nature had simply selected genetic variants that had already existed but had been hidden during the process of domestication. This raised a much larger question. Is domestication truly a one-way path? The story of the Campbell Island sheep suggests that the answer may be no. When environmental pressure becomes strong enough, nature can still awaken survival abilities that appeared to have disappeared long ago. But this story also has an ending that no one wanted. Daniel Wheeler cared for the world's only flock of Campbell Island sheep at Sticks Mill Nature Reserve in Christchurch. In February 2017, he discovered that 5 pregnant ewes had been killed. Their heads and the bodies of their unborn lambs were scattered throughout the enclosure. The person responsible had passed through 3 locked gates, even though vehicles could not enter the area. 5 pregnant ewes, representing 10 lives, had been taken from a population containing fewer than 40 breeding animals. Every one of them was irreplaceable. Wheeler was left with only about 30 ewes. A reward was offered, but no one was ever arrested. But that was not the saddest part of this story. On Campbell Island, humans ultimately became determined to eliminate this rare breed of sheep entirely, and they succeeded more than 2 decades ago. The campaign lasted over 20 years, from 1970 to 1991, and unfolded in 3 major phases. First, the sheep in the northern part of the island were removed. The operation was then expanded in 1984. Finally, the remaining animals were hunted through the island's valleys, mountain slopes, and densest patches of vegetation. They became increasingly wary, spotting humans from great distances before disappearing into the rugged terrain. But on an island covering only about 44 square miles, they could not hide forever. During the main operation in 1990, just 4 shooters killed approximately 1,400 sheep in 6 weeks. Before that, workers at the island's weather station had also shot more than 200 sheep over several years to help control the population. According to records from New Zealand's Department of Conservation, by September 1991, the final 2 sheep near Honey Peak had been killed. 2 months later, in November 1991, the last recorded sheep was shot beneath the southern slope of Mount Paris. It was a solitary ewe that had survived decades of eradication efforts. Nearly 100 years after James Gordon brought the first merino sheep to the island, Campbell Island's feral sheep population officially disappeared. In total, approximately 7,000 sheep were killed to give the island's ecosystem a chance to recover. Even so, the ecosystem truly did return. Humans did not reseed the land or replant each field. Instead, nature began healing on its own. According to long-term monitoring programs conducted by New Zealand's Department of Conservation, the plants that had survived on cliffs where sheep had never been able to reach gradually spread their seeds into the bare areas below. Within only a few years, tussock grasses began growing tall again, Dracophyllum shrubs expanded, and Campbell Island's giant megaherbs, one of its most iconic natural features, increased significantly in both number and distribution. Vegetation survey lines and fixed photographs taken over many years revealed a striking difference. Areas where sheep had been removed became increasingly green and densely covered, while areas where sheep had remained continued to stay barren and were dominated by tough plant species with little ecological value. This provided direct evidence that grazing pressure, rather than the island's harsh climate, had been preventing the ecosystem from recovering. However, Campbell Island still could not immediately return to its original condition. The compacted peat soil would require decades to recover. Some invasive grasses remained, and Norway rats continued devastating seabird populations until they were completely eradicated in 2001. Removing the sheep saved the vegetation, but eliminating the rats was what finally completed the recovery of Campbell Island's ecosystem. The story of Campbell Island is not just the story of a flock of sheep. It shows that humans can unintentionally create dependence, while nature quietly selects according to an entirely different set of rules. Merino sheep spent nearly 5,000 years being bred by humans to produce as much wool as possible, yet only about 90 years in the wild were enough for many survival traits to return. However, natural selection is never a miracle. Behind that adaptation were countless individuals that did not survive long enough to pass on their genes. And perhaps the greatest lesson is this: the success of one species does not necessarily mean the success of an entire ecosystem. The more the sheep population grew, the more Campbell Island lost the plant and animal species found nowhere else on Earth. Nature helped the sheep escape the limitations humans had created for them. But in the end, humans had to return to save Campbell Island from the sheep. If this story gave you something to think about, leave your opinion in the comments. Would you choose to preserve the sheep or save the entire island? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join me as we explore more strange but true stories from the natural world.